Today we will discuss how to address the structural issues that affect our economy in this online event titled Role of the State in Economic Development. I'm Ashraf Hayat, Executive Director of the Institute. A deep thanks to all for joining, and especially our speakers, Mr. Asad Omar, who has yet to join, Minister for Planning, Development and Special Initiatives, and the very distinguished Professor Dr Chang of Cambridge University. You honor us with your presence, gentlemen. We start with a short recitation from the Holy Quran. I will recite Surah Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'een. Ihdina as-siratal mustaqim, siratal lazina an'amta alayhim ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Ameen. We look forward to an informed discussion on why the Pakistan economy stays fragile and why it needs a structural transformation. We hope this will be a consequential interaction, as IPR's goal is to engender debate and disseminate ideas in support of policy making in Pakistan. We begin with introductory comments from Mr. Humayun Akhtar Khan. Humayun Saab has been in public service for 30 years. In 4 general elections, he was elected member National Assembly, during which period he was also the Cabinet Minister for Commerce and Chairman, Board of Investment. Among his many interests, Mr. Khan is also CEO and chairperson of this institute and a source of inspiration for all of us who work here. Establishing this institute is one manifestation of his deep commitment to making public policy and public institutions work for all Pakistanis. I request Humayun Saab for his welcome comments and for introducing today's topic. Mr. Humayun Akhtar Khan.
Okay, thank you, Ashraf Saab. I wish to thank the very distinguished speakers and the participants. We have a very active participation in our webinars. So we go straight to the why we are holding the discussion. For over a quarter of a century, Pakistan has been borrowing excessively from abroad to meet all kinds of external shortfalls. We borrow to meet forex needs for imports. We borrow to service past debts. We even borrow to meet current expenditure. And only 1/3 of what we borrow actually goes to development expenditure. That's why Pakistan's external debt is now virtually out of hand, and it has continued to grow. Every government over the last 25, 30 years that has departed has significantly increased the debt. And that over the last 20 years or so has grown 3 times the external debt. We have repaid principal and interest more than what we borrowed. And our model has led to almost a permanent external account vulnerability. The other trends that are taking place in Pakistan, the share of GDP in the productive sectors like agriculture and manufacturing is on its way down. Now, developing economies, of course, the share of agriculture in the GDP usually goes down, but it's accompanied by an increase in the manufacturing sector. But unfortunately, in Pakistan, even the manufacturing sector is going down. And the economic growth has basically come from the services sector. And exceptions apart, our services sector is not really exportable. And the result is that the export to GDP ratio, which was over 17% in the 90s, is now about 9%. And often an overvalued rupee further accentuated that situation as it encouraged cheap imports and placed exports at a disadvantage. That at least is not happening right now because we are actually, we have free floated our currency. Savings in the economy are too low and do not allow sufficient investment to sustain growth. Private sector credit is scarce. And the result is that over the last 20 years, our economy has consistently been close to default, with the current account mostly in deficit. Now, what do we really need? We need the economy to grow, increase exports, create new jobs for the large number of young people entering our workforce. And we feel that the state must play its role in achieving these objectives. At the minimum, it must ensure critical investment in infrastructure needed by the private sector. The labor productivity is low, and therefore the state must also invest in the people of Pakistan. There exists little to no product innovation, value addition, or employment of technology in Pakistan. And that is the primary reason why our exports are not even elastic to devaluation, because we have not really moved our exports with the developments in technology internationally. And therefore, even in years when Pakistan had no shortage of foreign capital, when they were getting a lot of foreign aid and debt, we did not make the necessary capital accumulation and structural transformation to build and upgrade manufacturing. And that, as we all know, is the only way to compete in the global market. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is what we have in mind today. We have as our speaker, Dr. Chang, one of the world's leading experts on industrial revitalization, and he is currently teaching and researching at the University of Cambridge in UK. We also have our own Mr. Asad Umar, the Federal Minister of Pakistan for Planning, Development and Special Initiatives. I think he'll be joining us lately. He just called us and said he might be a bit late, but he will definitely be joining. Asad is the leading proponent of what we are discussing today in the government. So I look forward to the two speakers about what role the state can play to revitalize industry and exports, and what government's plans are in this regard. And with these brief comments, back to you, Mr. Ashraf.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Chang, I'd ask you to click share screen in Zoom while I introduce you, and then you'll be able to show your slides. Our tech person has opened share screen already. So in addition to analyzing current economic trends or comment on government policies, our institute often tries to step back and look at big ideas. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Ideas based on evidence, and that can be hopefully employed in Pakistan, especially when the government is working for a strategic shift. And so it is greatly satisfying for us to have Professor Hajun Chang with us today. In addition to his many achievements in the world of academia, Dr. Chang is an internationally recognized expert on development and institutions, and he has advised many UN organizations and consulted with international financial institutions. To have Dr. Chang at IPR's discussion is a special moment for us. His research has been a guide for some of us here. Dr. Chang is reader in the political economy of development, Faculty of Economics at the University of Cambridge, and director of the Center of Development Studies there. His research questions some long-held myths about free markets and the role of the state, propagated in academia and also disseminated by international financial institutions. And he has done so by examining a vast amount of historical evidence. He has argued for a rethink of the orthodoxy that guides development policy making and our understanding of the role of institutions. And his studies show that though state intervention, I want to summarize on his behalf, and I hope I'm not making a big mistake in doing so. His studies show that though state intervention sometimes produce failures, it enjoys a better record for economic performance than unbridled free market policy. Of course, that does not make him a critic of the market, but only an advocate for well-considered development and industrial policies with a clear role for the state. Dr. Chang has the rare ability of translating complex ideas into easily accessible language. No surprise, therefore, that his 14 books, especially Kicking the Ladder and 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, have received wide acclaim and a number of awards. His is an extraordinary record of academic and policy work, and it is with great pleasure that we welcome to the virtual podium Dr. Harjun Chang. Dr. Chang.
Thank you, Mr. Hayat, Mr. Kant, for receiving receiving me into your institute with such kindness and praise. Yeah, I have only like 25 minutes, so I'm just going to make some big points and also give you some kind of examples, cases that make you rethink some of the conventional wisdom in development thinking. So let me start with a little story about this small car manufacturer in South Korea back in 1967. The company was called Hyundai, and it was set up as a joint venture with Ford. And it assembled this Cortina model, which was developed in Ford UK with almost entirely imported parts. The initial production that lasted for 3 years was just under 3,000 cars a year. So you could almost say that it was a glorified car mechanic shop. 3,000 cars a year means that basically 10 cars a day. In 1976, it launched its own model, having parted its ways with Ford, actually under government pressure, because in 1973, the government announced that Hyundai and all the other car manufacturers in Korea, which are all joint ventures producing foreign models, will be kind of deprived of their license to produce cars if they don't come up with their own model. Some stayed with joint venture partners to develop local model, but Hyundai decided to go it alone. And in 1975, it launched a new model called Pony. As you can guess from the name, it was a small hatchback car. I mean, that didn't look horrible, but I doubt whether many people would want to buy that kind of a car. And the initial production of Pony model was 10,000 cars a year. That was the first full year of production, 1976. And in the same year, General Motors produced 4.8 million cars. Ford produced 1.9 million cars. So almost 500 times that what the Hyundai produced in the case of GM, almost 200 times of what the Hyundai produced in the case of Ford. So if just think about that, if you took a time machine, went back to 1976, and told people, look, this totally unknown the car manufacturer just starting in South Korea, which at the time was a lower middle income country. Its income was not even 2/3 that of Ecuador's. But if you told people, however, in about 30 years, just over 30 years, that this company will be bigger than Ford. In the 40 years, this company will be bigger than General Motors. They would have tried to put you in a mental hospital. But that's what happened. In 2009, Hyundai produced more cars than Ford. In 2015, it started producing more cars than GM. And currently it's basically in the third place in the world market with cars like this. After the Toyota and Volkswagen, I mean, there are occasional years when GM might produce a few more cars than the Hyundai, but basically it's number 3 in the world. Now, how did this happen? Because South Korea, in the early 60s, when it launched this development program, was a very poor economy. And actually, that is very interesting to contrast that with your own country, which had essentially the same level of income in the early 60s. 6 decades later, South Korea's income is 25 times that of Pakistan's. South Korea is actually sending its government officials to Pakistan until the late 1960s to learn about development planning, because this was a time, this is a more dramatic graphical project, the presentation of how the two countries diverged. And at the time, Pakistan was the golden boy of the World Bank. The World Bank, unlike after the 1980s, World Bank was quite positive about the role of the state. It officially supported development planning, and it gave money to the South Korean government and told them, look, send your people to Pakistan. That is got best practice in development planning. Go and learn something. But somehow something happened, and there was this huge divergence. Today, South Korea, which started, in the 1950s, is that the main export items were basically the primary commodities, tungsten ore, fish, rice. Something like 80% of its export was primary commodities. Today's main exporter of the cars, mobile phones, liquid display, semiconductors. Pakistan, unfortunately, is still stuck in the basic stages of economic development. Around 50% of its the export is textile and garment. Another 30% rice, leather goods, and so on is basically primary product-based products. I'm not saying this to kind of boast about my country in front of my host. I'm just making you ask, why has this happened? Why a country which was equally poor and was actually considered behind in terms of its policy-making capacity by the likes of the World Bank, somehow became one of the richest economies in the world, and Pakistan, once a promising country, that I mean, that is why is it that stuck in this lower state of development? Now, of course, there are many complicated reasons, that basically that what happened in Afghanistan and the region, conflict with India, there are a lot of reasons why this has happened, but probably the most important reason is that Pakistan have failed to upgrade its the productive capabilities and production structure because it didn't use the policies that enable South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and many other countries in the post-Second World War period to propel its economy upward. So these countries used very strong industrial policy. They provided trade protection. They provided subsidized loans to strategic industries. They heavily regulated foreign direct investment. So some industries were cut off from foreign direct investment deliberately in order that local companies could grow. There were restrictions on majority ownerships. There were technology transfer requirements, local content requirement, many requirements that basically that while not pushing out foreign investors, policies that try to maximize the impact of their presence. Because if you just let them be, I mean, that many of these foreign companies will just import whatever parts they need from their suppliers, God knows where. I mean, China, Indonesia, Costa Rica, and then just do what some people call screwdriver operation. Yeah, so the
Dr.
local
Chang,
economy gets some. Yeah.
Dr. Chang, can you hear me? I don't mean
Yes.
to, I'm interrupting you, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
but just a little bit louder, if you could.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, my internet connection isn't great. So, okay, I'll try to speak louder. So, if you let these foreign companies be, they are not going to train workers, transfer technology, develop a local supplier network. You need to push them. So that's what these countries did. They used the state ownership, not necessarily extensively. I mean, Japan used very little, Taiwan used a lot. Korea was somewhere in the middle. It had a major steel company which was state-owned. I mean, they had a very pragmatic attitude towards state ownership. They're not necessarily in favor, but if the private sector wouldn't do something that they thought that was necessary, then why not? So when I tell this story, people then say, "Oh, yeah, but those East Asian countries, weird people who eat their rice with chopsticks, they are the exceptions, aren't they?" But in these books, Kicking the Ladder, Bad Samaritans, and many other academic writings, I have tried to show that actually almost all of today's rich countries develop through policies that are very similar to what the East Asian so-called miracle economies used in the post-Second World War period when they were developing countries themselves in the early 19th, in the 19th and early 20th century. I cannot go into the details. I'll pass on the kind of PowerPoint slides to Mr. Hayat so that he can share it with you. It has some details about what kind of trade policies they use, how they regulated the foreign direct investment, how they used state ownership, how they were lax in imposing intellectual property rights so that they can maximize technological imitation and reverse engineering. But the US, which has been the greatest champion of free trade, actually is the country that invented the first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, in his report to the US Congress in 1791, invented this theory of infant industry protection. And that's what the Japanese, the Koreans, the Chinese did later. The US pretends that, okay, maybe that we did the protectionist policies in the 19th century, but in the 20th century, we haven't the free market economy. Even that is not true. The Americans pretend that they don't have industrial policy, but they actually have the biggest industrial policy in the world. They pretend that they don't have state-owned enterprises, but they actually have the biggest state the enterprise in the world, only that is not called the state-owned enterprise, it's called US military. Because after the Second World War, the US government, through its military research funding, basically invented all the foundational technologies of the information age. The computer, the semiconductor was actually financed entirely by the US Navy in the beginning. The internet was developed by the Pentagon, GPS system, touch screen, you name it. Without this military research funding, there'll be no IBM, no Intel, no Apple, no Silicon Valley. So what are you talking about? I mean, they pretend that they don't have industrial policy and other countries just believe them, but they actually have the biggest industrial policy in the world. Okay, it was different from what Japan or the Korea used. It was less detailed at the sectoral level. It was kind of more about foundational research. But without the US government funding all this research, its economy will not be what it is today. Singapore is another interesting example. I often challenge my graduate students, look, give me one economic theory that can explain Singapore, because it's impossible to explain with one economic theory. It doesn't matter what it is, neoclassical, Marxist, Keynesian, because it's a combination of socialist policies and extreme capitalist policies. So when you hear about Singapore, you only hear about this the free trade policy and its welcoming attitude towards foreign investment, which they have, but you will not hear that 22% of GDP is produced by state-owned enterprises, including the famous Singapore Airlines, and in all sorts of sectors, not just the electricity and the usual. I mean, it's got state-owned enterprise in the semiconductors, shipbuilding and engineering, you name it. Yeah? 89% of land is owned by the government. Yeah? So it uses the land control to develop certain sectors. So when the Singapore government just over a decade ago decided that we are going to develop aircraft maintenance industry, it using its land ownership, basically built another airport just for that. In a country with so little land, if you had a privatized land market, it would have been impossible because it would be so expensive to do something like that. When they did that, Rolls-Royce relocated its aircraft engine research center because it was such a kind of agglomeration of top-notch technological capabilities. That's what Singapore is. And it's a perfect example of how we need to study real world examples. Because no one could have invented something like Singapore if that person tried to invent a well-working economy with an economic theory. Because it's got the Marxist element, it's got that extreme free market element, it's got more pragmatic developmentalist element, because, for example, it may welcome foreign investment, but not in a kind of discriminatory, generalistic way. It goes out, talks to particular companies in sectors that the government is targeting, comes up with the development plan with the company, and then provide the custom-made services. That's how they are able to attract the top quality investment, because there are so many countries who say, oh, just come and invest, we'll give you tax break, you can use cheap labor. But seriously, there are 130 countries that are trying to do that. Why should they come to you? So you need to offer something different. And that's how that Singapore succeeded with foreign investment, and becoming literally one of the richest countries in the world. I mean, that South Korea compared to Singapore is poor, it's 30,000. Anyway, I could, if you want, also talk about how the changing global economic conditions are constraining the scope for industrial policy, the emergence of the WTO, bilateral free trade agreements, regional free trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties and all that. They constrain what you can do. The rise of so-called global value chains, how do they change your constraints and opportunities? I mean, I can talk about that, but given that I will refrain from going into any details. But yeah, I mean, these considerations need to be made. But to wrap up my presentation, let me say basically two things. First of all, developing countries, but also the developed countries, because it's the continuous competition between different countries. Countries need to enhance productive capabilities. There's no two ways about it. You have to be able to produce more sophisticated goods using higher technologies, greater skill contents. You need to be eventually able to develop technologies used for those things on your own. And in order to do that, you need to develop not just individual capabilities. Of course, having capable individuals like the well-trained workers, the research scientists with PhDs from abroad, engineers with experiences earned in the global companies. You need those people, the well-trained managers, but you also need what I call collective productive capabilities, which are embodied in firms, public research institutes, economic institutions, physical infrastructure, because these are things that individuals cannot control. A very simple way of seeing the importance of collective productive capabilities is to think about a Pakistani engineer going to work in Germany or Japan. His productivity shoots up by 25 times. Why? Does he become suddenly cleverer? No. Did he get extra training on the flight to Germany? No. Because he's working with greater collective capabilities. So unfortunately, the mainstream economists emphasize individual capabilities. Of course, important. So they talk about investing in education and training, But you need more than that. You need to build corporations, yeah? You need to build institutions. You need to build infrastructure. So that's the first point. And the second point is, and actually, through historical experience, theoretical economic research, we actually know what to do. Yeah? I mean, there's ample justification for all the policies that Korea, Japan, and in the old days, the US, Germany, they have used to develop their economies. There's no great mystery. You basically need to provide protection and nurturing to your infant industries in the beginning, but then also invest in building their capabilities, pushing them to invest in the better technologies, train their workers, develop their own technologies, and discipline them if they don't perform. One important reason for the success of industrial policy in East Asian countries is that their government, while providing huge support, was willing to cut off the support if the performance doesn't improve fast enough. Yeah? Of course, that you cannot expect Hyundai in 1976 to become a world-class company in 5 years, 10 years. No, I mean, it took Hyundai basically extremely rapid development, but 15 years to become a world-class company at the lower level. It's only in the 21st century that it joined the top table. But so you need that longer-term perspective. But in the meantime, they were constant pushing, increase local contents, develop your own engine, do this, do that. So in a way, we know what to do, but of course the challenge is how you design policies that are pragmatic. While praising what Singapore has done, I don't recommend it to everyone, because their policies or products of the very unique condition that they are facing. They had no agricultural hinterland. They had that good kind of location on the trading route, and you cannot expect other countries to replicate those conditions. On the other hand, these different conditions are not all positive. Being a very small city-state with limited land, it basically realizes unless you control the land, control housing. Yeah, by the way, the 85% of housing in Singapore is provided by the government housing corporation. Unless they do that, they're going to have huge political unrest. Yeah, so they had to do that. Yeah, maybe having that level of land ownership by the government in other countries is impossible. Yeah, so you need to find your own formula. Yeah, and in doing that, and this is my final remark, I think you have to be ambitious in your long-term goal. People laughed at Hyundai when he said one day we'll be a world-class producer back in the 1970s. Yeah, it was a joke, wasn't it? When you think about it. Yeah. But you need to have ambitious long-term goal, because if you are going to be happy with selling a bit more of the same thing, or selling the slightly better things, then you become complacent and you will never reach the top level. So you need to be ambitious in your long-term goal, but you need to be realistic and pragmatic about the path along the way. Because in jumping from an economy which was 85% dependent on primary commodities to one of the most high-tech economies in the world, South Korea went through stages. Yeah, I mean, it didn't try to jump from the exporting fish to making the mobile phones overnight. Yeah? So in the beginning, it started with things that Pakistan has been doing, like textile, garment, making trainers for companies like Nike. Actually, in the 80s, something like 90% of world Nike output was produced in South Korea. So you start with those things, but then you keep moving forward, with the shipbuilding, steel, basic automobile, and then when you conquer that, you move on to the next stage, semiconductor, more sophisticated electronics, petrochemical, and then when you do that, then you get into really high-tech things. So it happened really fast, but it was a gradual, very pragmatic, painful process. So you need to really balance this long-term ambition and short-term pragmatism. Unfortunately, a lot of countries are either extremely ambitious without being pragmatic, or too pragmatic that they don't have any ambition. So how do you come up with a policy package that is both ambitious and pragmatic, ambitious in the long run, pragmatic in the short run, while taking into consideration your political economy situation, your institutional constraints of the global economy. That's a challenge that only you can meet. Foreigners cannot come and tell you what to do. That you cannot just pick up some successful example, whether it's Korea or Germany. Indeed, that you can only do this on your own. And I hope my intervention has been helpful in kind of provoking you to think about this in a slightly different way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hajun. And those are some important ideas about the role of state enterprises, and in fact, the role of the state in generating new products and upgrading marketing. I just leave a couple of thoughts with you, and when we go to Q&A, you might want to consider them. We too, in Pakistan too, we have state enterprises, but they're not very efficient even when they have captive markets. They tend to rely on government subsidies. So to continue with those kinds of state enterprises, what do you think a country should be doing? You gave the example of the Department of Defense, US Department of Defense, and you're absolutely right. Each technology that we have in the Apple iPhone, or in so many other things that are commonly used by us, were started by the Department of Defense and the organization DAPRA, which works under it. But does that not need very high level of academic excellence and research organization? So I just leave those thoughts with you. And your last point, my last point about something that you said, that why does a Pakistani perform better in a developed economy such as Germany? Because the productive capabilities there are much better. So it's the same person operating in a different productive environment. And what are the key steps that developing countries could take? And we're very fortunate now. We moved to Minister Asad Umar. Gives me special pleasure to welcome the Minister for Planning, Development and Special Initiatives. We're happy that he has spared the time to be with us, both because of his official role as the Minister in charge of development, but also because he's a leading proponent for revitalizing production and exports in the country. Asad Umar Saab was previously the Finance Minister. Twice he was elected to Parliament as Member National Assembly, where he has chaired two important standing committees, the Committee on Industries and Production and the Committee on Finance. Before politics, Asad Umar Saab distinguished himself in the corporate world, where he rose to become CEO of Engro, a corporation involved in a range of products that include energy, chemicals, food processing, and information technology. He is one of the top leaders of the governing Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf political party, and we are glad that he brings his broad knowledge to our forum today. It is my pleasure to welcome Minister Umar to the virtual podium. You have the mic, sir.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to join everyone, and it was fascinating listening to Mr. Chang. A number of things that he said which strongly resonate with me. The central being a couple of points. One, that getting straitjacketed into a particular ideological framework is not necessarily the best way to develop countries. And secondly, what works for one country does not necessarily work for another country, and therefore you have to learn from the world. So by no means am I recommending that you shut yourself off from the larger world. So you learn from everybody's experiences, but you have to then look at what works, and you have to be very pragmatic about it and iterative in the process of development. So see what works and double down on it and change what isn't working. The role of the state, I have to state this very clearly. What I'm stating are my personal views, and these are not the views or the policy of the government of Pakistan. Obviously, there is a significant amount of overlap in what I believe in and what the official policy of the government is, but there are some areas where my personal views don't necessarily coincide with the larger policy. I've been a part of this debate for a very long time of what the role of the state should be in the modern economy in Pakistan in particular, not necessarily at the global level, but in Pakistan. And I've been a participant in this debate from my days in the private sector. And I have been of the view, not based on any strong intellectual foundations, but simply on observation of what I have seen in Pakistan and what I have seen around the world, that this mantra, which has become very, very popular in Pakistan, which is the government has no business of being in business, is a nice, catchy line, but isn't necessarily true. So just a couple of examples of why I believe state-owned enterprises can play an important role, and a couple of examples of where I've seen them play an important role in Pakistan, and then I'll try and crystallize that into a generalized pattern of what I think where the state has a more direct role to play. And obviously, before I go into that, a general statement that I do believe that 21st century economy should be private sector led, and the real innovation, entrepreneurship that is going to come by and large in the larger economy is going to be led by the private sector, and therefore the state's most important role is to create conditions where competitive behavior takes shape, where there is risk-taking, where there is innovation, and those who do innovative work in the marketplace and are competitive are the ones who succeed. So that's the most important point. However, just focusing in on where the state might be able to or maybe needed to play a role, I'll just, as I said, I'll give you a few examples. Let's look at the world of energy, because I've been involved in that to some extent. Aramco is a state-owned enterprise. ADNOC is a state-owned enterprise. Petromina, Petrobras, and I can go on and on. The global energy landscape today is dominated by state-owned enterprises, and very, very successful enterprises. I started my career with HSBC for a short period, and then I moved on to ExxonMobil. And therefore it came as a massive shock to me the day I found out that Aramco had actually become bigger than ExxonMobil. It had a bigger market capitalization. Then we look at Dubai's development. And again, these are the point to highlight is that these are interventions of the state in areas which were absolutely vital for the development of that particular domain. So for a country like Qatar or Saudi Arabia, obviously their energy resource development was the most vital thing for their development. Dubai used the real estate that it had as the primary engine for that growth. And who were the most successful players? They were mostly state-owned enterprises. Emirates, which built the entire Dubai model, was built around Emirates, is a state-owned enterprise. Singapore was already alluded to, and the role that the state has played in the success of Singapore, and so on and so forth. But the latest global darling and the country which has over the last 30 years collectively performed better economically than anybody else in the world, China. I'm slightly dated in my data on China, but just going back 3 or 4 years, that was a year in which China crossed US for the first time ever for a country other than the US to have more companies in the Fortune 500 list than the US. Until that point, no other country had ever achieved that. So there were like 120 something companies from China in the Fortune 500. 80 of them were state-owned enterprises. So 80 state-owned enterprises from China had made it to the Fortune 500 list. The top 7 of the top 10 market capitalization companies in China were state-owned enterprises. So there are examples littered all around us. Obviously, the list of state-owned enterprises which have failed is an even longer list. There is no argument there. And therefore, I don't think the right thing to do is for the state to be doing everything in the economy. In Pakistan, just to give you an example, within Pakistan, where it may not necessarily be an ideological issue of whether the state is the right operator or owner of particular enterprise, or whether it should be private ownership, but it may lead more to governance. And the reason for the failure of state-owned enterprises in Pakistan may lie more in the failure of political governance of Pakistan rather than the ideological basis of this whole thing. I've been on the boards of many of the Pakistan's biggest state-owned enterprises. And most of this, not exclusively so, it was in 3 different regimes. But initially, I just give the example of some of the board memberships that I had during the Musharraf Shaukat Aziz era. And at that point in time, if you looked at the performance of PSO was competing head-on with some of the best corporates in the world, Shell and Chevron. Its market share had been plummeting. Its profitability was under pressure. And the government decided to revamp PSO. So in comes my former boss, mentor, the former CEO of Engro comes in as the MD. The chairman comes in as a career Exxon person, the deputy director marketing, a career Chevron person. And a few of us ended up on the board. 5 years later, there was a Harvard Business School case study on PSO's transformation. It had grabbed market share back from Shell. It had improved margins, and it was a transformed company while still the ownership had not changed. So here was an example of the same competitive landscape, the same industry, the same economy, and the state being able to play a very, very productive role. At the same time, I was on the board of, say, Port Qasim Authority. And in the duration of my stay on the board, I can't allude to a single point of step of reform that took place. So it comes back to, you can't do it in every case. In most cases, the state's intervention, direct intervention, is not going to be productive, and hence you have to be selective about it. So where is, in my opinion, I'm talking purely, I'm not a global academic, I can only talk from experience about Pakistan, my 3.5 decades of work experience in Pakistan. Almost 4 decades now, my God, I'm growing old. Okay, so which are the areas? Let's look at the the Pakistani private sector first, because I've spent most of my career in the private sector, 28 years in the private sector. The Pakistani private sector is not one which has been built around their ability, by and large I'm talking about, and I'm talking about the relatively larger sized corporates. I'm not talking about the hundreds of thousands of retail stores which operate in Pakistan, etc. Right? I'm talking about the relatively well organized private sector. This private sector is not one which has grown by its excellence in innovation, by risk taking, by its ability to come up with creative financial solutions, by its ability to create strong brands, nor is it a private sector which by and large is willing to put significant amounts of money at risk, i.e. put in money in capital intensive sectors where profitability is not almost predetermined. So now look at the last 30 years of Pakistani private sector investment. Where has the single largest chunk of investment gone into in Pakistan? It's IPPs, it's the independent power producers, where the determinant of success was not innovation, risk-taking, entrepreneurship. It was your ability to have the right connections on Constitution Avenue and be able to be amongst those who were chosen to do these projects. So there the private sector was willing to put in significant amount of money, but it was money which was literally like a corporate bond, where the yields were predetermined, and there was virtually no risk other than execution risk, and you could farm that out through EPC contracts to world-class organizations. There are very, very few Pakistani, can you think of too many Pakistani brands which have resonance outside Pakistan, have Pakistani companies? So without going on and on about it, therefore, there are some sectors in Pakistan which require significant capital outlay, where there is risk involved, and those sectors, despite having tremendous potential, are not developing in Pakistan. How many private sector Pakistanis have put in $3 or $4 billion investment into mineral development in Pakistan? The answer is none. And I can go on with this list of other sectors where there is significant risk and at the same time significant capital investment, and it's not happening. So therefore, I believe that on a selective basis, and that also can be time bound. To me, it is no surprise that 60s was the fastest industrial development era of Pakistan's history. That decade saw more industrial growth than any other. And one of the pivotal things that made that happen was the role of PIDC, the Pakistan Industrial Development Corporation. I thought it had a very smart model. Obviously, this is before my time, but from whatever I've read from literature, they came in, stepped into exactly the kind of thing that I was talking about, capital intensive, moved in, created the organization and exited. So this was not long-term engagement. So there are a few sectors. Another sector I'll tell you, oil and gas. Oil and gas, everybody keeps on talking about the potential of oil and gas in Pakistan. Oil and gas has been open for private sector for the last 30 years. The most profitable, the biggest players in the oil and gas sector is in Pakistan after 30 plus years of complete deregulation and anybody being able to come in is OGDC, PPL and Mari Gas, all three state-owned enterprises. So, and somebody, I did this calculation at some point in time, there was a significant value addition that has taken place as a result of these interventions. So to sum it up to the argument that I'm trying to make, Pakistan in the 21st century should be seeing a private sector-led development, which is not taking place in a pure theoretical laissez-faire environment. It is in the it is with a government which is actively working to create the collective infrastructure, physical and social, the legal infrastructure required, and ensuring that there is a competitive marketplace which allows the emergence of these innovative, risk-taking entrepreneurs, which Pakistan desperately needs. And at the same time, be willing to go in selectively in a very, very few sectors and that too, ideally in a time-bound fashion, to make strategic interventions to get the economy moving into a plane which is higher technology, higher skill sets, etc., and which then has a spillover effect. The kind of things that we were talking about, the kind of spillover effects that we have seen in the US with the Pentagon investments that have gone in. Even my ex-company, ExxonMobil, set up the first, the internet story is well known, but perhaps this is not that well known. The first petrochemical cracker was set up by ExxonMobil, and it was done like, what, 7 decades back, and it was funded by Pentagon, or at least partly funded by Pentagon. So some of those spillover effects, and they will not happen automatically. That's the other thing, that if you want those spillover effects to take place, then they have to be built into policy, and those linkages have to be created. Right now, this is one area where there is significant scope, especially because of our strategic program. There is very, very significant technological capability which is being built in the state institutions, but the commercial spillover impact of that is severely underutilized, and that's something which is under focus right now. There are discussions going on. So that is another aspect of the state intervention, which is the ability to take these capabilities which are built primarily for non-commercial purposes, but then being able to make sure that the maximum and commercial advantage of that is taken advantage of, and by the private sector primarily. So that's another aspect of the role of the state in the modern economy that I believe. So it's not one kind of a role, it's multiple roles that the state has to play. And simple statements like the government has no business in being a business really oversimplify the matter. I'll just stop here.
Thank you, Minister Saab, that you shared with us some important ground truths about the economy in Pakistan. I now open, of course, the discussion to all participants, and I request them to, there's a raise hand icon at the bottom of the screen. I request you to click the raise hand icon, and I'd be delighted to. I must say that Dr. Chang, I promised, will leave at 3:30 our time. So my request is, so that I can get as many people as possible to ask questions, please keep your question or comment short. Okay, we go to Shaukat Hamid Khan. And then Syed Rizvi, Dr. Muhammad Irfan, in that order.
Very interesting set of lectures, and I'm grateful to IPR for arranging these speakers. I'd like to say one thing. The theme of your talk, your conference was about the role of the state. And I don't think that has been adequately addressed. I mean, wherever there was an attempt to go for development quickly, fast, the best example before us is China. And China went through a state control. And they picked the winners. This happened with POSCO in South Korea, happened with the semiconductor industry. And everywhere the state chose the winners, went for them, gave them support, and so on. But when you talk of high tech, for example, let me share one other thing with you, because you've got other people wanting to ask questions and say things. You'll be so happy to know that there's a little item in Pakistan, high tech sector, lasers, and it's got about 26 billion rupees, about over $150 million of sales and exports to Malaysia, Bangladesh, and Switzerland. And even China came along once and took away some special lasers designed by us. So high technology is possible, exports are possible, but the state has to come in. There's nothing wrong with the defense sector coming in, already pointed out by several people. And if you look at I've been following the R&D budgets of the big spenders, 60 to 70% is defense related directly or indirectly. And it has very fascinating spillovers. One other thing you might be interested to know, that a small Pakistani company in Lahore used to make tripods for us, and they became very rich. And by 2017-18, they had about 12% of the EU market in theodolites, in tripods. And one of the unknown items in Pakistani, let's say, economy or industry. But ultimately, sir, development is done through people, for people, by people. And if you look for equity and sustainable development, it has to be done at the local level. Security, health, education, under law. And when it comes to the economic sector, you must have higher productivity. And this can only come if people have skills, higher skills, different skills to match the requirements of this age and this part of time in history. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Syed Rizvi. Syed Rizvi.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashraf. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Oh, it's a great honor to be here with Professor Chang and Honorable Mr. Asad Umar. My question is, before I ask a question, it's nice to see Professor Chang because I think I did once to him in
We have to go
Cambridge
to the
Business
question.
School, where I spent 6.5 years of doctoral research. So I just would like to ask, borrow a line from Alfred Marshall, which is a few blocks away from where he works, Professor Chang. Economics is a study of mankind in the ordinary business of life, right? So that incorporates and encapsulates everything. I fully agree with Mr. Asad Umar that the state intervention is essential. And especially in the third world countries, we see the state intervention there. So my question is, in the true sense, should politics be dictating to economics or economics to politics? And this is for both Professor Chang and Mr. Asad Umar. And this is for Professor Chang. The second question, Professor Chang, do you really think that the new institutional economics extension to institutional economics and new classical economics is more, pertinent to third world countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Rizvi. Dr. Muhammad Irfan.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you. So it's a distinct pleasure to be here, and I thank IPR for this opportunity. And thank you to both speakers. Dr. Chang, it's always a pleasure to listen to you. In such a short time, you put a very comprehensive talk forward. I have two questions. One of the things that Dr. Chang briefly talked about in his intervention is the idea of international agreements. In the WTO, international investment agreements, and that's an area where I work closely as well. So when you talk about industrial policy, when you talk about building productive capacities, there are essentially certain policies that need to be taken by the government, such as technology transfers, which are kind of forced through investment agreements. There are local content, there are subsidies, tariffs, those kind of policies. And often we see that they sit at odds with the obligations and requirements of those international agreements. And in the example of the bilateral investment treaties, Pakistan has recently suffered quite a lot as well. So I would want to ask where you think the need to conserve policy space in these agreements, whether it is existing and you need to safeguard it, or sometimes there is this penchant in countries to just sign international agreements because they look good on the country's CV. And apparently the belief that signing an agreement is necessarily going to bring in investment or development in the country. So how do you see that balance between the looking good aspect of an agreement and the need for conserving policy space? Secondly, and very quickly, we, through all the history of development, have seen, and in Pakistan's case as well, during the successful era that the Honorable Planning Minister mentioned, where industrial policy in Pakistan doesn't have a coherent industrial policy at the moment, industrial policy by definition is not confined to the Ministry of Industries. So it is a wide-ranging coordination between all faculties of government, if it were, with the ultimate aim and objective of a planned development. Now, in Pakistan, we have different rules of business and different ministries are in charge of different things. My question would be, where do you see the role of the planning ministry? And I ask this question of both speakers, to coordinate a large, wide-ranging and far-reaching development strategy? And is it the planning ministry that needs to take the role of coordinating between, say, the ministries of finance, commerce, investment, and industry and production? Or as we see currently, every ministry works in its own? Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Good, Irfan. That's very good. Dr. Parvez Tahir. And then we go to Mr. Hamid Hassan and Fazle Azim Tiwana.
Thank you, Ashraf. I just have to say that it was nice to see Hajun, my colleague at Cambridge. We went to Cambridge together. And I noticed that there is a certain convergence between the views of Asad Umar and Hajun. And I'm very happy to note that. The question to both of them is that in these days, does the state, to be able to contribute to progress, has to be authoritarian? That is the question. And I do want to sort of underscore the important role that PIDC played. You know, in one case, they sold an industry to private sector. Private sector couldn't run it, and it was given back to PIDC, and PIDC made it run again and sold it again. That is how a proactive public sector or government contributes to industrial development. Thank you.
Thank you, Parvez. Mirza Hamid Hassan, and then Fazle Azim Tiwana.
Thank you, Ashraf. I fully endorse the views of Minister Asad Umar that state has a very important role to play in the economic development of Pakistan, or for that matter, any other country. But looking at the experience of rapid economic development in the third world, and going by the examples that the minister himself of the countries that did achieve their targets in rapid economic development, starting from South Korea to Singapore, to Malaysia, to Indonesia, to all these countries, to China, of course, and then he gave the examples of the Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia or UAE, where the state played an important role. One comes to the conclusion that probably the Western model of democracy is too chaotic and too distracting for rapid economic development. Okay. And all these countries that have been mentioned, there's one thing common in them, that they had a kind of government that was different from the Western economic model. So I would like to have their comment on this observation of mine. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiwana Saab.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Can you hear me, please?
Ji, we can.
Assalamu alaikum to everyone. It's a great honor to speak over here, and it's wonderful to have Mr. Asad Umar. I wish to recall a simple event that took place where Asad Umar was present. Myself, General Parvez Musharraf, Razak Dawood Saab, and Chairman of Agricultural Development Bank, Firoz Bashir Ansari Saab was there at the first agri conference held in Pakistan at Marriott Hotel. Mr. Asad was there at the Exxon stall, and we passed by. After the inspection of the stalls, I put up an observation to General Parvez Musharraf, and that was this. Sir, this conference has been focusing on corporatization of farming. Now, this focuses on those farmers who are already very rich. what about the poor farmers? We don't want a situation where poor farmers will become more poor and the rich farmers become more richer. And we don't want to have a phenomenon where 22 rich families are holding the economic power of the country. Well, the response was very emotional, and it was on nationalization by Bhutto and other things. Subsequently, what happened was that I had to leave my profession as a banker. But then recently, a 20-year-old letter, which was then written to Shaukat Aziz Saab when he was the Federal Minister of Finance, was submitted recently to the Prime Minister's office for the kind eyes of His Excellency, the Prime Minister Imran Khan Ahmad Niazi Saab. And it's a happy coincidence that the pro-poor philosophy contained in that letter happens also to be the pro-poor philosophy contained in the budget 21-22. Now, this is a very great honor for me, and it has shown that when you have a private sector orientation in the government, things can move in the right direction with the right homegrown philosophies. Now, my question to Asad Umar Saab is that in 70 years of our existence as a Pakistani nation, 35 odd years have been under the rule of military rulers. Now, I would like to know from Mr. Asad Umar, what sort of a model, economic model was pursued by those military leaders that they progressed so well, while in the democratically elected governments, the progression was dismal and people really got frustrated. Now, this is a question that should come up from Asad Umar Saab. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Last question. I'm sorry, there are many hands, but I'd have to ask Hajun if he has, and the minister, if he can stay beyond, if they can stay beyond 3:30. But last question, Huda Re-Energia. Huda Re-Energia.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, sir. I am actually belonging from a village called Looni. It is near Sibbi in Balochistan. I am a research scholar at Applied Economic Research Center and recently just joined Re-Energia group of companies as a research associate. So my question is to our Minister of Planning and Development. Sir, we as a youth, we voted for you because you promised us such a beautiful picture of education that you brought forth with your agenda. So I want to know what has been done on that. Like when I see the news, when I see that Bangladesh is spending more than 9% of their GDP on education, and their 19.7% from their public sector development towards education. And then I see that when PTI came, they actually, in fact, gave a cut in the education. Now that they have adjusted in this budget. But however, I would like to know as a youth, sir, where are your promises? Also one very important thing, that due to coronavirus, a lot of my friends belonging from Husdar, belonging from stranded places, they did not have internet availability in their area, and a year they are in the laggard, and now a year has been it was wasted for them. So, sir, why not provisions of public digital libraries in our areas? So, sir, I would like to raise this question to you. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the minister, the two speakers, Professor Chang and the minister, there are 5 more questions. Would you like to come in and close it at 3:30? It's 3:24 or 25. Or do you want to extend it beyond 3:30? Professor Chang?
Yeah, I can stay like till, well, 3:40 your time. So
all right. Okay.
Yeah.
Minister Saab, is it okay to take another?
That's about the max that I can strategy. Another 10 minutes after 3:30.
All right. We really can't take all the 5 questions. So Wasim Vora has been speaking at each one of our events, so I would have to ask him to excuse me. Nazif, Ishtiaq, and Ubaid Patel Saab. And then we'll close it there. Go ahead. Nazif Ishtiaq and Obed Patel, any one of you unmuted, and would you like to speak?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. An excellent session as always. Some very enlightening discussion. I would carry forward some thoughts of Honorable Minister Asad Omar on development. He spoke about government intervention, and the countries that generally were referred to were the likes of Singapore and UAE and China. And these countries are very, centralized form of government. There isn't it's not a fragmented sort of government structure over there. However, we know the situation in Pakistan. As I head the Committee on Urban Development of the Federation of Pakistan Chamber of Commerce and Industry, we are very well aware that as far as the rural-urban migration in Pakistan is concerned, it's one of the highest in the regions. And it is estimated that by 2030, more than half of Pakistan's population is going to be living in urban centers. So my question is that with this kind of rural-urban migration and the very fact that 80% of world GDP is coming through urban centers, that is cities, what is Minister's vision with regard to the form of government structure and robust government intervention that we need to ensure that economic development and growth and a conducive environment for all that is generated in Pakistan, particularly in cities like Karachi, where different tiers of local government and provincial government and federal government are overlapping with little influence and little coordination between one another. Thank you.
We can go to Mr. Arif Bilwani, but is he there? To Mr. Arif Bilwani, and that would be the last.
Yes, sir. Thank you for allowing me to participate. Sir, I want to remind all the audience, particularly the minister, honorable minister, that in the 70s, the government did intervene in the industrial sector and took over many industries. But everybody knows their fate. What happened to them?
All right.
Because of the government intervention.
Okay, thank you.
Secondly, sir, sorry. Secondly, in the past, we had PKIC, IDBP, BL, NDFC, etc., all the institutions for the upbringing of the industries. What we have now, not a single institution. There is no 5-year planning or 3-year planning, mid-term planning or short-term planning. There are no plans. In the past, we had to have 5-year, all those sorts of plans. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I apologize to Mr. Wasim Vora and Hafiz Usman Saab. We have to go back to the speakers. It's almost 3:30. Minister Saab, please.
Right, a number of questions. I'll try and run through them quickly. The first question was, who's going to be responsible? Industrial policy cannot be implemented just by the Ministry of Industries. So does the Planning Commission have a broader integrative role for overall development? If you read the rules of business of the government of Pakistan, they'll probably still say that. But the reality of Pakistan is that since 1988, we have been almost constantly in IMF programs. And when you go into an IMF program, you need one central pillar who will be responsible for delivering what has been agreed upon in that program. And that task has been assigned to the Finance Ministry. So in Pakistan right now, frankly, the shots on economic strategy are called by the Finance Ministry. That is why almost always the chair of the ECC is the Finance Minister. And that's where it sits right now. It used to be different back, obviously, in the 60s and 70s. The Prime Minister has said this to me a couple of times, that I want the old Planning Commission back. But I think we first have to get out of the IMF program or be able to put ourselves on sound fundamentals of macroeconomic stability before we can go towards that. Second question was the examples that I gave and is democracy and development, I certainly don't think so. I'll give you examples from our own region of democratic countries which have done well economically. And one is India, the other one is Bangladesh more recently. India has done it spectacularly well if you take into account all the challenges that they had. Remember, when the Britishers walked in, it was one of the richest countries on earth. When they walked out, it was one of the poorest countries on earth, which saw regular famines with hundreds of thousands of people dying. From that base where India is today is a spectacular achievement politically of keeping that nation together and still providing economic growth and significant economic growth. So no, I don't think democracy is anti-development. Plus that option of this very centralized system is not available to countries like Pakistan, which are multi-ethnic realities, okay? A 97% Han Chinese China might be able to have a very, very centralized system. And remember, the whole philosophy of the citizen-state relationship in a Confucian society is very different. The basic trust level between state and citizen is very, very different from our kind of a society, which are tribal in nature, which are Bradri-based network, kinship-based networks, where the trust levels within the tribe, within the Bradri are very, very high, but the trust levels across these kinship levels are very, very low. So no, I don't think that Pakistan can be run successfully is anything except a democracy. Somebody talked about the performance of Pakistan under dictators, and they did very well. Well, that depends on your definition of doing well. Ayub Khan's 13 years, Ayub Khan and Yahya Khan 13 years ended with Bangladesh creation. The Zia era ended politically with Sindh and turmoil, and even though we are opponents of People's Party, if Benazir Bhutto had not emerged as a national leader, God knows where the sentiment in Sindh would have gone. Economically, it was such a successful era that one of the 2 or 3 conditions laid down at the time of transfer of power to Benazir Bhutto was that there was an IMF agreement already negotiated sitting on the desk of the Prime Minister, and she had to sign it. So that's how much success we had in the 70s. The Musharraf era ended up with Balochistan up in arms. So if you want to run a multi-ethnic Pakistan, it has to be a system. And I'm tying it in with another question which was asked about the government structure and the devolved nature of Pakistan. I think Pakistan has to be run as a devolved state. There are no two ways about it. There is no going back to the devolution process that has started. In fact, it needs to be taken further. If you're going to turn Karachi around, you have to have a local government system in place, not just in Karachi, but all over Pakistan, of large cities like Karachi, having significant empowerment to take economic and administrative decisions for their own development needs. However, what is needed that if you're going to run that devolved system, you also need to put in institutional structures which allow for the cooperation between these different institutional tiers, especially in a multi-party democracy, so that you're able to work together while having your own spheres of influence and your rights of taking decisions under the law. And I think what you saw with the NCOC was an example of an institutional structure being created, which allowed for this to happen in the larger sense. But this was an ad hoc arrangement. The 2 institutions that we need to strengthen in Pakistan, one is the National Economic Council, and the other one is the Council of Common Interest. These 2 institutions provide the political administrative platform for a devolved country to come together and do decision making, which works best for the majority of the country. So I strongly believe in a democratic Pakistan, in a devolved Pakistan, and strengthening our institutional structures which make that devolved Pakistan work. Then there was one specific question, I just answered it in the end, which was what did PTI do for investment in education? Obviously, I can answer only for the federal government. I'm happy to tell you that the development expenditure on higher education, which is what the federal government is responsible for, has gone up 2.5-fold in just these 4 years. So there has been massive increase in the investment in higher education by the PTI government, which is exactly what we believe in. That's exactly what we demonstrated in the 5 years in KP. On the internet availability, I've got good news for you, and you're absolutely right. there is, it is absolutely a fundamental right for every child, every youngster in Pakistan, whichever part of the country they belong to have the access to these modern tools, to be connected to the world. And I personally went, visited Avaran, Turbat, Khuzdar, Gawadar, all these places. We've started a massive program. Internet availability is being made available there. There is 4G networks being laid there and skills training going on so that youngsters from these areas can actually become participants in not just the national economy of Pakistan, but the global economy sitting in these remote cities. So that's, I'll end on that happy note.
Thank you. Those were some very valuable ideas. Professor Chang.
Thank you. A lot of questions, so I cannot do justice to them, but let me have a go. Yeah, first, there were a lot of questions about state-owned enterprises and then also extensive comments from the minister. Yeah, I agree with the minister that, you know, we shouldn't have a blanket view of state-owned enterprises. You know, after all, there are many different reasons why we have state-owned enterprises. In some sectors, it's because of the need for the long-term capital. In other sectors, it's that because of a high risk. In others, it's to guarantee access to essential services. So you cannot apply the same principle to all sectors. But yeah, basically you need the management reform. Sometimes you need privatization, but you know, even there you have to be pragmatic. You know, countries often make mistake of announcing this big privatization program, you know, which basically knocks down the price. You know? Because if you sell them one by one at the opportune moment, depending on how the sector is doing, how the world economy is doing, you can get much better price. But we are trying to sell dozens of enterprises at the same time. Very often you have to give discount. I mean, there's only limited appetite, yeah? And you are trying to sell everything at the same time. And some sectors some enterprises might be doing badly, not because of their own fault, but because of the conditions in the particular sector and so on. So even when you're privatizing, I urge that gradualist approach. And yeah, I mean, basically on the issue of state-owned enterprises, I follow what Mr. Deng Xiaoping, the former Chinese leader, said. I mean, I don't care whether the cat is black or white, as far as it catches mice. Yeah. So if it's doing well, fine. I mean, don't sell it. If it's not doing well, then think whether you can solve this through management reform or you need privatization. It has to be case by case and pragmatic. There were a lot of questions about the nature of politics. One was the democracy, the other was decentralization. Well, I talked about some dramatic cases from Korea, Singapore, and so on. But you know, let's not forget that these are not the only countries that achieved economic development. You know, a lot of European countries, France, Finland, Norway, and so on, used East Asian style industrial policies in the 50s, 60s. I mean, between the 1950s and 1980s, under fully democratic conditions. You know, Japan was a fully functioning democracy when it conquered the world with its own industrial policy. You know, Korea and Taiwan eventually democratized. You know? So I think this attempt done by some people trying to associate industrial policy with authoritarianism, I think is completely wrong. You know, on that account, you could say that you know you could point out that none of the Western countries, you know, the US and the European countries, were democracies until the 1940s. You know? You know, these countries were not democracies, yeah? Not even informal sense. Yeah? They didn't give votes to women, ethnic minorities, poor people. You know, the elections are rigged. Yeah? I mean, the MPs could be bought up at any time, you know. So these countries coming back today and lecturing other countries about democracy is really rich, you know? Because they did not develop under democracy. So, however, I'm a firm believer in democracy, you know, and the experiences of many European countries after the Second World War and Japan show that you can use a pretty strong industrial policy under democracy. So let's not try to create this false association. You know, if that's how you want to play the game. I mean, not you personally, but how some of the free market economists want to play the game. I could point out that the American slave owners in the 19th century were the biggest supporters of free trade. You know? So do I tarnish the free trade with that association? I wouldn't. So the other people try to say, oh, we cannot do industrial policy because it means giving up democracy. I think it's being very, very dishonest at worst, and at best totally misinformed. You know? About decentralization, yeah, I think that especially for countries of countries like Pakistan with the size and the diversity, I think that a more federalized system is better. But, you know, I mean, don't think that industrial policy has to be done at the national level. The Germans, the Italians, they do little industrial policy at the national level, but their local governments, many of them, not all of them, have had very strong industrial policy. So typically German states will own a development bank and work with the private sector to develop the commercial technologies together, you know, give the extra funding, you know. You can, and in many contexts, you should do it at the local state level rather than at the federal level. Yeah, the relationship between economics and politics. Well, I think that distinction is actually a bit artificial because economics itself is political. You know, where do you draw the boundary to the market? That's a political decision. You know, in the 19th century, a lot of people thought that people should be allowed to own people. You know? They defended slavery, you know? And any attempt to abolish it, they denounced as encroachment on the people's private property right. You know? Now, that was a totally political decision. So I think that the distinction between economics and politics actually, in the end, rather artificial. But yeah, I agree that on a day-to-day level, the boundary is fuzzy, but more or less set, and you need to operate with it. And yeah, I think that basically my view is that that these people who try to say any political intervention in the economy is unacceptable is actually basically trying to defend the status quo, you know, whatever that is. You know? Because even the free market economies have their political views on what should be allowed as a market transaction, what shouldn't be. Huh? I mean, would you allow the markets in human organs? You know, in Iran, I'm told that it's legal to sell kidneys. Why not? Yeah. So that when you say that the government shouldn't touch the existing boundary between economics and politics, you know, that basically people are saying what we have now is fine. Any attempt to change it is unacceptable. That's a very political position. Finally, I think the roles of international agreements. Yeah, I mean, I briefly mentioned this, but I think that people, well, let's put it this way. You know, I sometimes joke that the WTO has become the best friend of lazy government officials in developing countries. Because when your minister tells you to do something, all you have to say is, oh, minister, that's banned by the WTO. The minister is not going to run to the library, go through 700 pages of WTO agreement and tell you, oh, no, actually, you can do it. You know? No, actually, under the WTO, yes, it's got more restrictions than in the old days, the GATT system. But there are still a lot of things that you can do. I have written about this, actually, some of them with Dr. Muhammad Irfan, who used to work with me. There are a lot of things that you still can do. And, I cannot go into the details. A lot of countries have used those remaining policy space. This is not to say that it's what you have is enough. I mean, the international system has to be formed because there are certain things that just make it very, very difficult for developing countries to use policies that they need to use. But I mean, let me tell you that there are a lot of things that you can actually use. And yeah, I mean, it's also not as if in the 1960s and 70s, everything was allowed. GATT had certain rules. So you have to be careful not to break them. I mean, sometimes you have to operate under the radar. Sometimes you have to fudge things. And that's how the countries like South Korea got away with it. Today is more difficult, but you can do a lot of things, believe me. And I mean, I cannot go into the details, but I can refer you to some the details through Mr. Hyatt. So I'll finish my remarks there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Those were two brilliant presentations, and we thank the speakers very much. Mr. Humayun Akhtar Khan may close the meeting, please.
Thank you. Excellent couple of hours, and I truly thank Professor Chang and Asad Umar, the federal minister, for some remarks that are very close to our hearts at IPR. We have done a lot of work, many times guided by Professor Chang's work and other scholars in the world. So key takeaways, I won't take too long. Great things. All states and various stages of development have more or less done the same thing. As time moved on, they might have become more sophisticated, but they have gone through the same stages of development, starting from protection, infant industry, to trying to make them competitive, to make them export oriented. Two, there's no one model fit all. I think that was a key thing I picked up from Professor Chang. A country has to see what their situation is and what their competitive advantages are and what their markets are. And three, very important. I mean, it has to be a combination of vision and pragmatism. And may I add, if I may add one more thing to it, patience. One has to be patient. This journey is long and arduous, and vision must always be there, but have a long-term vision with some short-term and medium-term objectives, but they all need patience. Look after your people, not only train your people, but also look after the general well-being of the people. That's also important. Build institutions, build a productive environment. And that's where the state really comes in. That key function of the state is to help build institutions. The institutions will not be built by the private sector, or a productive environment will not alone be built by the private sector. They can be given incentives. And the other thing I picked, incentivize and regulate FDI. Then don't make it just free for all. Anybody can come in and you have this special economic zone and this list of 100 incentives, and don't pay any tax and don't bring any technology and take your money out whenever you like. They might as well invest in the stock exchange or something if they want to do that. One of the key things I picked up, be different. There are 130 countries offering more or less similar investment thing. Be different and see if you can start with sectors and start with facilitation and see if you can just go and personally bring investors. So I, of course, I take a great interest in what happens at IPR, but I beg to differ a bit from some of my speakers. I still do not believe that the state should be in the business of running industries, unless very selectively, a state should be in the business of making policies, creating infrastructure, keeping their own fiscal affairs and balance of payment affairs in order, focusing on policies which allow capital formation, where businesses can make money and then reinvest that money and move into more high technology and more value-added items. Yeah, PIDC was a good example, but PIDC was created when the private sector was not forthcoming in a particular sector. Yes, and of course, PIDC used to exit. Now that could be a good formula. Just do a very simple thing: make credit available. If not concessional, but at least make it available. The business can do well. In the end, one last note I will say: the world is also moving now. You see these Bretton Woods institutions just a few decades back, but thinking differently. Professor Chang said that they, at that time in the 60s and 70s, believed in the state intervention, and subsequently they moved into total free flow of capital and free trade and total free markets. So, but the world is changing. The world has moved from Keynesian, which involved a lot of state intervention, to neoliberalism, which involved the famous Chicago boys, which involved no state intervention, totally free markets, and assuming that eventually the free markets will take care of everything. And I think that now, if I may say, I'm not a researcher, but I think we are moving towards what is being coined as, or should be coined as, neo-Keynesian, and that sort of is a mixture of free markets and selected state intervention. And that is my thinking as of right now. There may not necessarily be IPRs, but I take great pride in chairing IPR. Thank you very much, the very honorable speakers, and just as illustrious participants, for a very productive session this afternoon in Pakistan and morning in Cambridge. Thank you.
Thank you all, and we end this session. Thank you again. Goodbye.